was right here above. Look, it's that high. Bearing down on me. It was like the apocalypse, mate. It was like hell on earth.
2020 is proving to be a very challenging year. It began with a scorching roar. The summer burnt its place into history and seared the national psyche.
This summer has changed Australia. It's changed some of our landscapes, perhaps permanently. It's changed our people.
Black Summer, as it's now known, was one of the longest and most widespread fire seasons in our history. The conditions for it were fuelled by a changing climate, and no one can say we weren't warned.
Climate change and the impact of climate change is no longer a future event, it's now a present event.
Nobody, no politician, any side of politics, has any grounds for saying, oh, well, we didn't see it coming. You know, it's been coming, they've been told, and yet somehow, for some reason, our political class is incapable of grappling with this.
For some time now, experts have been warning that 2020 will be a tipping point for the climate. When we do get through this COVID-19 crisis, the world will meet again at a climate conference in Glasgow for yet another attempt to find consensus on climate action. For decades, climate policy has been a battleground here in Australia. Tonight on Four Corners, some of the key players in this drama, the bureaucrats, the scientific advisors, and the politicians, speak out about what has been perhaps the greatest policy failure of our generation.
What climate policy? I mean, it's a mess. It's incoherent and has been for a decade.
The response felt disdainful. It was almost this sense of, you know, who are you to come and talk to us about these things? And in my naivete, I didn't realize that climate change was a no-go zone.
The level of intellectual input into that argument has been close to zero. It's about having the strength to lead, and it's about staring down some people who you know are basically wrong, whatever their motivation might be.
For more than 30 years, politics has been grappling with this issue and failing to deliver. This is a story of power and ambition triumphing over the national interest.
I think the history of this has more to do with personal ambition than anything else. It has a bit to do with ideology, that's true. But I think more to do with personal ambition and some of the individuals involved taking the opportunity of an ideological chasm to advance their own personal interests.
What is really clear is that the electorate see something like climate change as a test of a leader, and all of these leaders have failed.
To understand Australia's failure to deal with the climate policy challenge, you have to go back to 1997, when global discussions on tackling climate change began in earnest at the Kyoto Climate Summit. At the time, Ken Henry was a senior Treasury official. He was at the cutting edge of policy formulation in Australia for decades.
For Australia, it was seen as a risk, not as an opportunity. And the Australian negotiators going into the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol, it was not their intention to secure a strong commitment to reducing global emissions. Rather, it was their intention to ensure that the burden on Australia was as small as possible.
Under the Kyoto Protocol, Australia would eventually be required to reduce domestic emissions in the second 5-year period below 2000 levels. Senior bureaucrats believed the best way to do it was an emissions trading scheme.
So what were you telling John Howard then, or the Howard cabinet?
Well, the advice from the Treasury was, right through that period, consistently was the best policy approach would be an emissions trading scheme of some form.
Ken Henry first presented a plan for an ETS to Prime Minister John Howard in 2004. An ETS puts a cap on emissions and requires emitters who exceed the cap to pay to do so, usually by buying and selling permits on an open market. Howard wasn't convinced.
Oh, I don't think the mood was there at that stage, but I think the risks to the Australian economy, concerns about coal and energy industries, concern about industries like aluminium, were concerned that didn't want to put Australia at a disadvantage relative to the rest of the world.
If you look at the 10 hottest years ever measured, they've all occurred in the last 14 years.
And the hottest of all was 2005.
The groundbreaking documentary Inconvenient Truth added to growing international pressure for action on climate change. And with the millennium drought hitting hard, Ken Henry and the bureaucrats tried again to convince Howard of the need for an ETS.
Our ability to live is what is at stake.
Through 2006, it was clear that the wave of public opinion was leaving the government behind. And it was increasingly clear to policymakers in Canberra, myself included, that the government was going to have to do something additional, and it was going to have to be something pretty big, not just more of the same. And so I did see an opportunity late in 2006 to go once more to Prime Minister Howard and say, look, I really think now is the time to have a serious look at an emissions trading scheme.
And what was his response this time?
Yes, he bought it.
Peter Shergold was the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet.
This is one of the most eagerly awaited reports that's been presented to the government.
The first time I got seriously involved, I suppose, was in 2006. It became obvious that there was at least a window of opportunity, not necessarily a very wide window, but where I was given the opportunity to head up a task group on emissions trading, a group of secretaries and rather more business leaders to examine what was going to happen within a global emissions trading scheme and how Australia should be best prepared if one was to be introduced.
I get a phone call that says, from Ken Henry, saying, Peter Shergold and a group of us have convinced John Howard that we need to look at this. Are you prepared to lead the Secretariat? And my reaction was, what do I know about climate change? And the response was, that's exactly why we want you to lead the Secretariat. You know, we want somebody who's going to come at this with a clean slate.
By now, John Howard knew business was also keen for a policy solution.
Increasingly, I think he was hearing from business leaders for whom he had significant respect that there was a great degree of investment uncertainty because of the risk associated with climate change, that investment, particularly in energy, was being deterred, and it would be helpful if the framework could be clear for business going forward, that the uncertainty for them at that stage was becoming increasingly troubling.
By the beginning of 2007, political pressure was building too. The new Labor leader, Kevin Rudd, pledged to forge a national response to climate change.
Climate change is the great moral challenge of our generation. The sentence in question from our Climate Change Summit, which I launched in opposition in March of 2007, was, climate change is for us the greatest economic, environmental and moral challenge of our generation. And guess what? It was then. Guess what? It is now. And my position hasn't changed one bit.
Thank you.
Sensing the political threat, John Howard recognised the need to shift.
Thank you very much.
That moment was incredibly exciting, and the fact was that John Howard took this proposal into the Cabinet, and this Cabinet had people like Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull sitting in there, and Peter Shergold and I were in the Cabinet room. We presented the findings, and the Cabinet endorsed where John Howard was, and Prime Minister Howard then sent me off to go and actually design up in full detail what would be his emissions trading scheme.
I announced specifically that Australia will move towards a domestic emissions trading system. That's a cap and trade system beginning no later than 2012.
You look at the polls, it was probably an election which he looked relatively unlikely to win. And often in those situations, you can get a Prime Minister and a government deciding, well, to do things which they wouldn't in normal circumstances. But that, to me, is why you have, in a sense, those magic moments when you have that conjunction which allows you to achieve things.
To be fair to him, he'd gone on a journey. You know, he had believed early on that we should act. Then, you know, from his perspective, things changed, and then the opportunity came again. And he took convincing, but I have to say, you know, I give him absolute credit. He never pushed back on ideological grounds. It was always wanting to understand, can this practically work? What will be the practical implications of it? How can we ameliorate some of these consequences? What's it likely to cost? And that's exactly what he should have been doing.
So by the end of 2007, reform seemed almost unstoppable. The Coalition, Labor, the Treasury, business and environmental groups all supported an emissions trading scheme. It would prove to be the last time a broad consensus on the issue was ever reached.
It was, in a sense, I always used to say, you know, my greatest achievement. It was, of course, almost my most abject failure in that, you know, nothing then happened. And I don't think I anticipated then that even with the change of government, it would all come to nothing.
When you look back on it, that was a rare moment of consensus given what happened afterwards, wasn't it?
Well, the bottom line is, had Howard won that election, we would have expected him to have acted. And certainly, given that I won that election, I proceeded to act.
As the newly elected Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd gave the task of constructing an emissions trading scheme to the Climate Change Minister Penny Wong and her assistant Greg Combet. They gave it a new name, the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, or CPRS.
I was appointed Minister for Climate Change and Water when we won government in 2007, and I had a couple of tasks. One was to develop a whole-of-economy emissions trading scheme, which was the CPRS, and we had a very detailed process of engagement with stakeholders, a lot of policy work, a lot of design work.
But the world was about to change, and political and economic priorities were about to take a dramatic turn.
For Wall Street, the hits just keep on coming. A day after investment bank Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, another corporate titan is teetering on the brink.
Blair Comley had just taken up his job at the new Department of Climate Change.
When the GFC struck, I would characterise that we had some businesses, in particular, who had been saying to us through the year, look, we understand that the community wants to act on climate change. We understand we'll have to make some sort of contribution to that. Let's work together to try and work out what a good design is. Once the GFC hit, some of those businesses, particularly the ones who were internationally exposed, they were saying, I'm really concerned about my business and I can't really bear any imposition that might come with a scheme at this point.
Climate change is one of the greatest...
While business wasn't happy, neither were the Greens. They argued the CPRS wasn't going far enough and declared they were never going to support it.
We will not walk away from climate change!
It's not good for the nation or the planet. I think it's a real failure.
I think they wanted a grandstand. You always... I mean, they're the counterpart of the deniers. Right? They are not prepared to compromise in any way. They've got this purist view of the world, and they are totally and utterly naive about what's required to get us from where we are today to what is needed.
Madam Acting Deputy President, isn't it significant?
When the CPRS was first put to a vote in the Senate in August 2009, the Greens joined with the coalition to defeat the bill.
Let me look at the tax.
And at that point in time in particular, they were so purist, nothing was ever good enough, you know. You had to stop coal-fired electricity tomorrow. 100% renewables today. It was just absurd and unrealistic. The consequence of their position would have been the loss of tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of jobs, hit to the economy, like a ridiculous position.
It was a dog of a scheme, CPRS, CRAP, and it would not and could not have brought about the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that this nation and the rest of the world wanted, because it had built into it the acquiescence of the coal industry, the fossil fuel industry, the logging industry, and the big end of town.
I still had some hope. I mean, I was very disappointed, but I still had some hope that that was a temporary state, that maybe that was the response of one or two particular politicians that had decided to make that, you know, their charge, but that by and large, everybody would come to their senses sooner or later. That didn't happen.
Here we are. I've got no idea where we're going.
The Labor negotiators focused their efforts on Malcolm Turnbull as the best chance to secure a bipartisan agreement. Turnbull had been one of the most prominent supporters of an ETS as Environment Minister under Howard. As opposition leader in 2008, he was advocating a consensus position.
I did negotiate an agreement with Malcolm because I believed it was in the best interests of the country to have bipartisanship. It's such a big policy, has such long-lasting effects. I believed it was in our best interests as a nation for there to be bipartisanship.
I saw there was a window, but a rapidly shrinking window of opportunity through which we could get a bipartisan agreement on an emissions trading scheme. And if the ETS, or as Rudd called it, the CPRS, had been passed at the end of 2009, it would now be about as controversial as the GST. In other words, not at all.
But Malcolm Turnbull didn't have the grip on his party that John Howard had. He faced powerful opposition from the Conservatives. You failed to get consensus within your party to do that. Why do you think that was?
Well, again, and it has continued. It's become a fault line within the Liberal Party. It's become a galvanising issue among the right wing of the party. It's extraordinary, really, that something that should be, as I used to say all the time as PM, a matter of engineering and economics, has become one of ideology and idiocy.
John Howard's authority allowed the party to function and suppress that civil war. But as soon as John Howard wasn't there, then those forces which had been, kept under control by Howard suddenly broke free.
His sort of determination that we should support the Rudd bill carried big risks internally. One of them was fracturing the coalition itself. There's probably only one Malcolm Turnbull in our lives. Leadership is a very sophisticated, complex art. And I think Malcolm, for all his strengths, is a remarkable human being, but I think he demonstrated that he's not cut out for leadership of a broad-based party like the Liberal Party.
In the charmless backrooms of Parliament House, the government was still trying to strike a deal with Turnbull. But in public, Rudd was taking great pleasure in hammering home the political advantage.
It's time for the real Malcolm Turnbull to stand up. Is it the Malcolm Turnbull who was supposed to be gung-ho about this 12 months ago? Or is it the Malcolm Turnbull of today seeking some short-term political advantage?
I think Kevin used the climate issue as a means of... He did everything he could to wedge me against the right wing of my own party. So Kevin's goal was to disrupt, blow up, my leadership of the Liberal Party.
I think he tried to use the one instrument, the CPRS, to achieve two objectives. One was to address what he describes the greatest moral challenge of our time, and the second was to destroy the possibility of Malcolm Turnbull becoming Prime Minister.
So we're supposed to be Mahatma Gandhi, Winston Churchill, as well as technical climate change negotiators all at once and maintain an even temperament throughout. For God's sake, this is Australian politics. We have a mandate to bring this thing in.
Turnbull tried to stare down the opponents in his own side.
I could see the tide was moving against action on climate change within the coalition, and I wanted to make sure that we got this law passed when we could.
I will not lead a party that is not as committed to effective action on climate change as I am.
Yeah, that was a most unwise thing to say, and everybody was shocked by him, in a sense, making it a lead. He was the one who then, by saying that, made it a leadership issue. That was most unwise, and I told him so.
Turnbull persuaded a majority of his shadow cabinet to support the bill, but the leadership team had misread the mood on the backbench.
Senator McGorry, do you still plan to cross the floor on the ETS legislation?
And I won't be supporting an ETS under any circumstance.
William, I'm going to toilet.
The coalition members gathered for a joint party room vote.
Mr Turnbull, will your leadership be safe if...
What happened in that room would change the course of Australian politics and kill any future hope of a bipartisan agreement on climate policy.
Can you go?
Yeah, well, as it was quite a dramatic party room meeting, one I went for a while, because unusually just about everybody in the room had something to say on the subject. It was clearly pretty clear the party room was completely divided on this, and there was a lot of angst and a lot of concern about the shadow cabinet proposal.
One of Turnbull's closest allies, Andrew Robb, turned against him.
And it was, one of those pin-dropping moments, because, Andrew and Malcolm had been seen to be close. You might recall Andrew had been Malcolm's running mate back at when we lost in 2007, when Malcolm ran for the leadership then. And so for Andrew to get up in quite strong terms and with a lot of internal authority in the party and say this is a crock of whatever and we shouldn't support it was a very dramatic moment, and you could see Malcolm getting increasingly angry and upset with what Andrew was saying, but it had a very big effect in the room.
Well, I was shocked by Rob's intervention. It was a very treacherous act and was described, I think Ian Macfarlane described it at the time as the worst, most treacherous thing he'd ever seen in his parliamentary career. He basically laid in wait and then ambushed us in the room.
Seven days later, the Liberal Party room removed him. Do you consider that to be a failure of leadership?
Well, I failed as leader to persuade the party to go along with it, and then I was removed as leader, so I suppose so.
Tony Abbott won the leadership contest by one vote.
Congratulations.
Thanks very much.
How are you feeling?
I am feeling a bit overwhelmed, and there'll be a press conference shortly, OK?
Thanks.
Thank you.
The vote was also a crushing blow for those working behind the scenes to design a carbon pricing mechanism.
Yeah, it's terrible. Yeah, just terrible. And also, it was the circumstances of the rejection that it was just so obvious that this was a result of personal political ambition more than anything else.
Of course, they would argue, Tony Abbott, Nick Minchin, Andrew Robb, those people would argue that they were trying to save the Liberal Party because this was an issue that was going to tear the party and the coalition apart.
Well, I was frankly more interested in the national interest than the future of the Liberal Party of Australia.
The next day, the CPRS was put to the Senate once again. The Greens were now the only hope the Rudd government had, but once again, they voted against the bill.
Why would the Greens go into a Faustian bargain, which the government set by deliberation, under the pressure of the big polluters?
for a party that is avowedly committed to acting on climate change to actually tear down what was put in front of them, I think is unconscionable.
Did we expect the Green Party to come on board with us in that vote? Yes, we did, because we believed they, of all people, would put the long-term national transition of this country to a decarbonised economy as number one priority. Instead, they played rancid short-term politics instead, and should be forever held accountable for that.
The Greens political party voted with the people who supported Tony Abbott. They voted with Cory Bernardi. They voted with Nick Minchin, who said climate change was a conspiracy to deindustrialise the Western world, to sink action. It was an example of the extremes of the political spectrum working together to prevent change, and we have paid a price as a country for it.
We voted against it because Kevin Rudd and Penny Wong wouldn't negotiate with us. They negotiated with the Liberals.
Isn't something better than nothing? The bureaucrats all say what we needed was a mechanism. We could have argued about where it was pitched after that and continue to argue about it.
Well, it's not just the bureaucrats, it's the coal industry that wanted that scheme. And had we been locked into it, we'd have been locked out of the innovation and the real carbon, a flexible carbon trading scheme that's essential now for us to get out of this appalling situation which humanity's in, not just in this country, but right round the planet.
Tony Abbott's political attack was relentless. He continued to define any attempt at pricing carbon as a big new tax on everything.
The coalition will not be going to the election with a new tax.
It was incredibly effective. It was what opposition leaders do. They're negative. They punch holes in the government's policy. I mean, it's an easy attack to make, right? At the time, people were very worried about cost of living. They could see the cost of living in terms of a range of things moving up, and they could also see what they saw as a kind of a downward pressure on wages as well.
It had become an extremely divisive external environment. So very different from 2008, 2009. And then in 2011, the conversation went well outside the Beltway and essentially became a highly, divisive discussion in the public.
Realising public support was drifting and under pressure from some of his cabinet colleagues, including Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd dumped his policy response to the generation's greatest moral challenge.
I decided reluctantly that the deferral was the best way to preserve the internal stability and unity of the government.
People saw that as you basically walking away from what you declared as being the biggest moral challenge of our generation.
You might describe that as walking away from it, and I know most of the Green Left commentariat find it convenient to describe it in those terms. A deferral from 2010 to 2012 is not walking away from it.
And what did you think at that time?
Well, I thought, well, we've been working for 2.5 years. It would have been nice to happen. I was disappointed.
It was never really seen as a deferment. It was really seen as defeat. And so there was a general collapse in trust in him.
Mr Rudd has a challenge on his hands. Why has he run away from what he said was the greatest moral challenge of our time?
It certainly, as you can see, diminished his political capital very significantly in the community. He'd taken a stand, then seen to back away. Probably a lot of people thought just another politician, not really full of conviction about the reform that he wants to make.
Today is all about one thing.
Rudd's authority was ruined. He had the trigger for a double dissolution election on the issue, but never used it. His leadership never recovered.
Confident, Ms. Gillard? Ms. Gillard, are you confident you got the numbers? Interesting day at Mill.
The new leader of the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party, elected unopposed, is Julia Gillard.
Gillard seized the leadership and called an election.
Order, the House will come to order.
Under pressure in the campaign, she made a definitive statement that would dog her for years to come.
Prime Minister, no mention today or tonight, as a matter of fact, about the carbon tax. Have you decided that's going to cost you votes? Is that why it's on the shelf?
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pity she said that as well, right? those sorts of commitments. You can understand why politicians make those commitments, but it's nevertheless a pity that under pressure they feel it necessary to make commitments of that sort, which they must know are going to come back to haunt them in some way or another.
I, Julia Eileen Gillard.
Gillard was elected in a minority government and, with the support of the Greens and key independents, pushed ahead with a new version of an emissions trading scheme.
I offer you my very warmest congratulations.
It's now a situation where we went on to show that Greens, in balance of power, when we do get the power, will deliver the goods. And that's what happened after 2010.
The new ETS required big emitters to purchase carbon permits. The starting price was fixed at $23 a tonne. It looked like a tax.
It was an emissions trading scheme and a carbon pricing scheme, and it had a fixed price for 3 years that you can characterise as a tax, a carbon tax, but it was actually then transferring to a floating price emissions trading scheme.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, let there be no doubt about the intentions of the authors of this carbon tax legislation. They want to kill manufacturing industry in this country. We want to say, first, we don't want a carbon tax, and second, we do want an election.
As Abbott's Chief of Staff Peter Credlin let slip some years later, climate policy had presented a potent political opportunity.
It wasn't a carbon tax, as you know. We made it a carbon tax. We made it a fight about the hip pocket and not about the environment. That was brutal retail politics, and it took Abbott about 6 months before he cut through, and when he cut through, Gillard was gone.
How effective were those attacks?
Yeah, they garnered and agitated, a part of the community without any doubt, and were supported by the Alan Joneses and shock jocks of the world around the place too, and News Corporation jumping on board and running campaigns.
You've just got to look at the way the Murdoch media and other right-wing voices, 2GB, people like Alan Jones and Ray Hadley and others, have been relentless in their criticism of anyone or any policy that seeks to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or address climate change. I mean, people who take climate change seriously are described by some of the News Corporation columnists as warmists. It's that absurd.
In defiance of Abbott and some sections of the media and industry, the Gillard ETS bill was passed in November 2011. For the first and only time, Australia would have a working emissions trading scheme.
When you look back at what we did put in place, it was legislated in operation for 2 years. Greenhouse gas emissions started to decline. They declined in that 2-year period. Power stations didn't close, steel mills didn't close, Whyalla was still there, jobs were still there, the economy continued to grow and jobs continued to grow.
I really thought it was a workable solution. It may not have been everything that all the scientists wanted, but it was a start. And that is what's needed, is the start to see the emissions turn over and go down.
Absolutely, emissions were falling, and the history records that. You can see it now. Australian emissions, there are very few periods in Australia's history where emissions have in fact fallen, but they did fall through that period, very clearly.
Gillard was punished by some in the media and slumped badly in the polls.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Rudd was reinstated as Prime Minister and promised to move to a floating and much lower carbon price. But the public had had enough of the Labor government.
I can inform you that the Government of Australia has changed.
All those in favour, please say aye.
The new Abbott government delivered on its promise to dismantle the ETS.
That's a single voice. I think the ayes have it.
For those who'd spent years working behind the scenes, the celebration on the floor of the Parliament that day was hard to digest.
Honestly, I thought it was grotesque. You know, it didn't even look like a high school schoolyard. It looked like a primary school schoolyard. Terrible.
I thought it was a pretty grim day for Australia. I thought it was one of those situations where don't get too happy, guys, because we're going to be back, tackling this issue pretty shortly. We might not be tackling it in the same way, which means that we'll be doing it in a manner that's going to be more costly to the Australian people.
I do feel that my time was a failure for the greatest thing that could have come out of that time and did not.
Which was?
Which was serious action on climate change.
We took on the responsibility for fixing Labor's budget mess.
As Prime Minister, Abbott's policy response was called direct action.
We've also passed our direct action plan, which will make a practical difference to the environment without slugging you with a carbon tax.
Now, you described that at one point as bullshit, I think. Do you still hold that view?
I mean, the sort of the premise of it is it's no regrets investment. You know, if you're paying people to plant trees, it's not the most economic way to reduce emissions probably, but it's, there are worse things you could do. But it was essentially a short-term fig leaf.
You can adjust your policy, but the idea that you should do nothing or pretend that woefully inadequate targets, for example, are an appropriate response because it might shave a fraction off somebody's electricity bill somewhere, is, in my view, dangerous and is totally not unsupportable.
Malcolm Turnbull was successful on 54, Tony Abbott 44.
In 2015, the revolving door of leadership struck again.
I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull had a chance to remake the Coalition's climate policy. His cabinet endorsed what they called the National Energy Guarantee, but the divisions within were as deep as ever, and once again, climate policy would prove to be his undoing.
There was a group that was determined to use it to threaten the whole existence of the government. Abbott, from the time he ceased to be Prime Minister, he was using all his efforts to bring down my government. So that was, but he was not the only one. I mean, there are others, but the fact is that they had a very strong backing. They were amplified in the media.
Tonight, Malcolm Turnbull's big switch. The Prime Minister backs down on his emissions target to shore up his leadership.
That crazy, frantic week here in August 2018 saw the climate wars bring politics to the boiling point once again. The great fracture point of Australian policy spelled the end of another leader. Malcolm Turnbull was removed as Prime Minister, and the latest attempt at formulating a policy response, however weak, was cut dead.
We have allowed something which should be a question of physics and economics and engineering and, how do we do it and when do we do it and where do we do it, to become this whole crazy political, punching bag.
There'll be people watching this also who'll be frustrated that they're hearing this from someone who was the Prime Minister, who was steering the country and couldn't deliver.
Well, ultimately, you can't, it's not a dictatorship. Some people will say, Malcolm should have stood up to the right. Well, I think I did that on several occasions.
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal. It was dug up by men and women who work and live in the electorates of those who sit opposite.
The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has also been a frontline figure in the climate wars. The core of the Morrison government's climate policy is the Climate Solutions Fund, a continuation of Tony Abbott's direct action plan.
It's incentives. The Climate Solutions Fund, as did the Emissions Reduction Fund, provides incentives to reduce emissions, but it's carrot, not stick. It's technology, not taxes. It's choice, not coercion. That is the approach we're taking.
All these things that the Liberals come up with to sidestep actually doing something comprehensive, they cost taxpayers more. The silly emissions reduction fund things they come up with cost taxpayers more for every tonne of greenhouse gas emissions reduced than an efficient economy-wide scheme.
Energy Minister Angus Taylor says the answer to reducing emissions is new technology.
Ultimately, reductions in emissions will happen when technologies that work, that are at parity with their higher emitting alternatives, where rational people choose them because they're good choices. That's how we'll bring down emissions globally, and Australia is absolutely committed not just to using those technologies within Australia, but playing a role in areas like hydrogen, integration of household solar, and land management to help other countries to reduce their emissions in that longer term time frame as well.
The big policy thinkers say technology alone isn't enough to save us from a climate crisis. They still believe the best solution is to put a price on carbon.
The carbon price isn't about taxing people. Carbon price is actually about creating the right sort of incentives to develop the technology and then use it.
The question you should be asking yourself is, what is the least economically damaging way of achieving that cap on national emissions? And the answer to that question, and everybody will tell you this, is an emissions trading scheme.
The roller coaster of Australian politics has left us in 2020 with no structure for pricing carbon in the future. And if the history of climate policy is anything to go by, reaching climate consensus at the next Global Climate Summit in Glasgow is far from certain. The climate crisis has exposed a systemic failure that many of those who worked for so long in the system find hard to accept.
We have failed. There's no doubt about that. We've all failed, I think. I mean, I look back on it now and I still feel gutted. You know, all these years later, I still feel, no, it's more than that, I feel angry. You know, I know that's not a good thing. And I probably should get therapy. But I've asked myself this question many, many times. Why do I still feel angry about it? And the reason I feel angry about it is that I feel angry about what Australia has lost.
It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion. To almost be able to visualize this and to see this happening, and year after year after year go by without any strong action, and no apparent commitment and determination on the part of governments, and I say plural because we've had several since then. It's beyond disheartening. It's depressing.
If you were Secretary of the Department now, what would you say to the Prime Minister?
You, much more than me, Prime Minister, can create the narrative. That's what a leader does, to create the narrative of why we need to do this. But my sense, Prime Minister, is that there is a mood to follow such leadership, if it exists, and tell it honestly and tell it truthfully, and don't try and pretend there are not going to be costs imposed on industry and costs imposed on individuals. But it is worth that for the sake of your children and your grandchildren.